Thanks everyone so much for joining us for today's webinar brought to you by Codefresh Live. Today we are presenting next gen deployments at Skillshare. And our presenter is Mr. Adam Hawkins, staff SRE for Skillshare. And he's going to show you how Skillshare is building extendable and compostable pipelines using Codefresh and the journey it took to get there and where they are today. So first, those couple housekeeping notes. You'll notice that you cannot talk, you are on mute. However, you do have the chat, so I encourage you to use the chat and the Q&A button. And if you have a very complex question, you can also request to raise your hand and then I can give you permission to talk. But please enter all of your questions in the Q&A box. That really allows us to keep track of them. I don't want to lose track of your question and miss it accidentally in the chat. This session is being recorded and a copy of the recording will be sent to you by probably later today, tomorrow at the latest, so you can share with everyone. And lastly, please remember to reference codefresh.io/events for our upcoming webinars, as we have fresh informative webinars for you several times a month. So with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Adam Hawkins to start the presentation. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Taryn. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you everyone for coming and joining me for this webinar. So as Taryn mentioned, I'm going to be talking about basically how we migrated to Codefresh and how we succeeded at that, what we learned, and I think how it can be useful to all of you. So if you haven't heard about Skillshare, Skillshare is an online learning platform where you can sign up and take classes, mostly for creatives, but all kinds of different skills you can learn. You've probably seen some ads on YouTube. At least that's how I first found out about Skillshare before I even started working here. So before we get into the meat of the presentation here, I want to give you a little bit of background on our internal org structure. So we are about 35 engineers. We're divided up into two different groups of engineers. We have the foundation engineering team and the product engineering team. And here's me right down there at the bottom of SRE. I'm just sharing this with you so you have some context really for our org size and why we make some of the decisions that we do. So a little bit about me. As you know, my name is Adam Hawkins. I have about 10 years of experience in this industry. I work as a staff SRE in Skillshare. My primary responsibility is doing what it says back here in my background, which is trying to do better software faster and teaching other people how to do the same. You can follow me on Twitter at adman65 and also check out my podcast on smallbatches.fm. If you like this type of material, I talk a lot about software delivery, DevOps, and the theory of software engineering and business, which really frames actually the motivations for us adopting Codefresh and how we work at Skillshare. So let's begin. How did we come to Codefresh? So we had a set of business problems actually. So we're a growing engineering team. We have just raised a lot more money. We plan to hire more people, and we're trying to build an engineering team that lasts. So we already had established some like CI/CD practices, and they were working, but we were butting up against all these problems. Like one of them was, we weren't able to manage our secrets inside code or like inside our pipelines. They were in some like GUI, and that was just really hard because there was no way for us to track them and change them, or let alone like use different secrets on different branches. So that it was okay, like we could get by, but we didn't like it. And then the other thing was, I think like many different teams, we had applications that have multiple processes. So for example, if you consider the 12-factor app model, you might have one service with one process. Maybe it's a web server, or then the second process might be a background queue worker, and even a third process might be some cron or something else like that. But we had applications like that didn't really fit too well in the tool that we were using. like I said again, we were able to make it work, but we didn't really see a future where it could support all the things that we wanted. So it just kind of kept adding up. And then the other thing was we really wanted to have all of our pipelines in code, YAML files like you would expect if you've worked with any type of tools like Circle CI or actually pretty much everything all these days is just YAML. But we were still working in a GUI, and that created the same problem like the secrets, where we weren't really able to make changes to the pipelines and test them out on feature branches or anything like that. So we had, a central choke point, but it was okay. People were able to deploy, we were able to get things going, but it was sort of just rubbing us the wrong way over time. And then we really started to hit up into this other issue where we weren't able to extend the pipelines that we had. Like if we had a new requirement, the only thing that we could do was submit an issue to the support team and hope that their product development team would take it on and eventually deliver it. And I don't know what everybody else's experience here in this area is, but that's really a hope and a prayer if it even gets done, and if so, when. We were able to move much faster than them, but the situation, the product didn't really allow us to do that. So we just had to sit around and wait. And this one was actually the scariest to me because, given that we were supporting a growing engineering team and our technical requirements were changing, the thought was, what are we going to do if we have, a requirement from the product side or the business side or the engineering side that we just can't fit into our current tool? And then what? So we really started to think quite a lot about alternatives. Is there something that we can do with the current tool? Like, what can we actually do about this? So let me give you a short history lesson here. We're going to step back almost a couple years back in the future. So what you see right here is what I call T0, which is a situation at Skillshare long before I joined, which was everything was in a state of various ad hoc solutions to different problems. There was no standard solution across all of the different services. Sure, all the services were deployed to Kubernetes, but they were all the deployments were done differently. Maybe it was scripts, maybe it was something else. And there was no rollbacks. There was no real strategy or solution for how are we going to do deployments, let alone how are we going to trigger deployments and track that they actually happened. So our first problem was trying to move from this to something that we had unified CD. So what we were able to do was first lift all of our different services onto a standard platform, which was creating Helm charts, migrating onto our previous tool, and then coordinating all of our deploys in Slack through our chatbot. So that gave us the structure. From there, that was about a year ago, about a year and a half ago, actually now. So we were able to get to this point where we got stable. So then we come back to about now, where this happened in April, where we were stable. We didn't know what we were going to do. We didn't really have an answer to any of those business problems. We weren't specifically looking for anything else because it was stable and we didn't really want to rock the boat. And we thought it was going to be a lot of effort to move to a new tool. But then we just happened to get an unsolicited cold call effectively from Steven at Codefresh, and it piqued my interest. And we got a demo and with one of my coworkers, and we thought hey, this actually looks like it could solve all the problems we have. But we had become a little bit jaded from our previous experience. So instead of just saying, okay, this looks good, let's sign, let's move forward, we said, no. We're going to do a whole POC. We need you guys to do a POC for us that can meet all these criteria, and then let's talk. Because we did not want to go through this effort of migrating and then falling back into the same set of business problems. So What Codefresh was able to do for us was build a proof of concept pipeline. So we were in an advantageous position because we had already created what we called like a playground service. And what this was just a really pared down version of our actual services that we had like hooked up to all of our different automation, and uh, so we could test out different parts of this. So what I did was I just gave them a zip file of that code and said, here's the pipeline. Can you build it? And if you can get this done in a week, let's talk, because we were under a really tight deadline. And much to my surprise, and really to credit to the team at Codefresh, they were able to put together a proof of concept pipeline that proved support for all of our critical business requirements. Let me just walk you through that real quickly. So the first one was a way to easily coordinate parallel sections of the pipeline. So we weren't really able to do that very nicely in our previous tool, but we could in Codefresh. So success there definitely made work a lot easier for us. The next thing was probably like our biggest one, which was we wanted to move to secrets managed in code with SOPs. So SOPs is a tool by Mozilla that allows you to like keep secrets encrypted in your source control and decrypt them. And sort of the TLDR of this is that you can pass those decrypted files as values files to Helm charts. So this gives us a way to keep all of our configuration, both plain text and secret text, in code, which you weren't able to do before. So the next thing was we had what we call pre-flight checks and smoke tests, which you can actually see also like in two different parts of this pipeline. But these were written as Kubernetes jobs, and the implementation is pretty simple. It's kubectl apply this manifest, wait for the job to complete. If the job succeeds, move through the pipeline, otherwise fail. This turned out to be a huge problem in the previous tool for quite surprising reasons I don't want to get into. I didn't think that we would need to specifically call it out in the POC, but I did anyway, just for certainty's sake. So we got that. It worked. The next thing was being able to be very specific about the type of things that we were going to do in the deployment pipeline. Like if we could apply one deployment manifest at a time, then it would be like easy to do things like blue greens and canaries and kind of coordinate a multi-process workflow, because maybe if you have multiple processes, one has to go first or one has to go second. Like there's some logic there. So given that we had that fine-grained control, we on our side could write the pipeline that made sense for that particular service, or we could just do kubectl apply and throw everything, at Kubernetes and have it do whatever. So check, we were able to do all these different types of deployments. And the next one was a new feature for us. It's something that we wanted to have in our previous tool, but we just could not get it for whatever reason, which was using our SLOs in Datadog as verification criteria in the pipeline. So the idea here is simple. We do a deployment. After the deploy succeeds, we would connect to Datadog, find SLOs, look up their SLIs, like these are the key metrics that you want to verify, like say request success rate or any other type of thing you can think of, and check those metrics for a few minutes after the deploy so that we could either say, hey, deploy worked good, or it didn't, and let's roll back. And that would allow us to do canaries and all kinds of other, more complex verification logic in our pipeline. So they were able to put this all together for us in a week, which really surprised me, and then just gave me the confidence that let's move to the next step here. So one thing that has happened before with these different sort of CD and CI tools was that they would be tied to a specific Git repo. And that was problematic for us because we needed to coordinate this big workflow of all of our different services. So we have what we call our on-demand sandboxes, and you can do a command in our Slack channel called sandbox create. It will trigger a pipeline that will clone all the repos, generate all the manifests, and then deploy everything to one of these sandboxes. So we needed to verify that we could actually clone all the different repos and coordinate, like a multi-repo pipeline. So it took a while to get the pipeline working, but hey, it worked. So success there too. What's going on here? Okay. So we had verified all these criteria. Like the key ones was secrets with SOPs. This was like one of our biggest pain points, actually. We had multi-repo pipelines and was extendable. So they had actually shown us how to create custom steps, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. And that this whole thing was YAML. So they sent us a YAML file and they sent us, the pipeline and Codefresh so we could see. So everything looked good from our side. So we decided to pull the trigger and put the pedal to the metal and just go all in on moving our stuff to Codefresh. So I want to share a little bit about our step library. So once we had we already had an idea of all the different like building blocks we would need in our pipelines because we had gone through this exercise of creating them before in a previous tool. So I went through all the exercises of like identifying these specific areas and working on reusable steps such that like we, as the SRE team, part of the foundation engineering team, could say, hey, here's all the steps that you can use, take them from our step library and use them to build your pipelines, them being other members of Skillshare engineering who build and deploy services. So I want to give you a look into what one of these steps looks like. So this is our run job step, and it applies a Kubernetes job, waits for a completion, and then shows the output. So one thing I do really like about Codefresh is that if you document your steps well, they'll give you, a built-in UI that you can use as documentation for your steps. And if they're public or private, it doesn't matter, but anybody in your Codefresh account can see this. So me, as a member of the SRE team, can say, oh, product engineering team, we're using this step. Like, how do I do X? Like, how do I change the timeout on a job? I can just point them to the documentation for the step. And over here on the right, you see the output that we've created and, just made it nice. And so there's some colors and it has some headers and you can see, and if the job fails, it will find logs to the job and print it out nicely and, the right colors. So that gives you kind of an idea of the type of steps that we're able to create. And as far as like DX goes, we use the same like output format and all of these things with these arrows and colors. And so they all look the same such that, if you're a developer, you don't have to learn how to, mentally parse different output as you use different steps. DX and UX in this area is really important, which is also one of the things that Codefresh, I think, does very well. It was immediately obvious to us given our past tool. So one thing that we were also able to do is we took this step library and then we used Codefresh to build our Codefresh repo, which includes these steps. So you can see here, we use the parallel functionality. We're able to do linting on all of like our bash scripts that we have for these steps. We're able to build everything in parallel. Then we can even do a smoke test of the individual steps themselves. So one thing that's actually really nice about Codefresh is that you can build an image in the pipeline and then reuse it in subsequent steps. So without having to actually push it up to another registry. That turns out to be really, really handy because you can also build a Docker image to encapsulate everything you need to run the steps in the pipeline. This turns out to be actually one of my favorite features of Codefresh, and I've used it over and over again in different projects. So one thing that also surprised us was the ability to coordinate really complex workflows. So by default, things will just run in sequence, and if anything fails, the whole pipeline will fail. But you can use what they call advanced workflows to set your own success criteria for individual steps, also conditional logic for what needs or the conditions for a step to execute or perhaps skip. So what you see here was the first ever automated Terraform deployment pipeline in one of our Terraform projects. We were able to build this whole pipeline, and then this is not on the slide, but yesterday I was able to make all of these different things conditional such that if you look at, say, the plan steps here, this is the Terraform plan in Sandbox, if there's no diff, then we can skip all of these different apply steps. So we would have never been able to do that in our previous our previous tool. So the fact that we were able to do that with Codefresh just, even more sealed the deal. So one thing that was also really handy for us was the ability to do composable pipelines with what they call the Codefresh run step. So what we're able to do is create pipelines for, like, say, synthetic tests or end-to-end tests, and then trigger these for other pipelines. And what this gives us as an engineering team is the ability to have like pipelines as a team interface. So for example, like the SRE team, that's me, we maintain the synthetic test pipeline. Another pod maintains the end-to-end test pipeline. So it's all, independently owned. The pipelines are autonomous and they're embeddable in other pipelines. This really gives a nice way to mix and match like higher level functionality in the pipelines. We weren't able to do this in our previous tool. This was, again, like icing on the cake that we came to find out about later. Okay, so that was all I had actually for the slide. So now I want to give you a walkthrough of some of the code for these steps and what this looks like in practice to actually build these things. So one thing I would like all of you to take away from this presentation is that Codefresh is far more extendable than I thought initially. The fact that you can create your own step to bundle up complex logic and also provide your own Docker images gives you the ability to pretty much implement anything that you can think of. If you need custom requirements, you need to install software, anything that you need, you can bundle up in one of those ways. Also, one thing that I haven't mentioned yet, but which was part of our acceptance criteria, was the ability to run the builds on our own infrastructure. So Codefresh has what they call the Codefresh runner. So you can install this on your cluster. We use Kubernetes, so we install all of this on our sandbox, our staging, and our production clusters, so that when somebody does a deploy to one of those environments, it actually executes on that cluster. And that gives us full access to everything on the cluster, all the specific services we would need to do, pretty much, everything. So odds are, if you have a requirement, you can implement it on Codefresh if you set out to, or if you allocate the time for building a Docker image or creating a step. That's what I want to show you now before we get into the Q&A. Let me share my screen with you again. Okay. So hopefully this one is full size.
Full screen looks great. Thank you.
All right. So here we have our Codefresh repository. This is where we keep all the code for our different steps. So we have our codefresh.yaml file where we list all the different steps. Here you can see the parallel step, which includes all the sub-steps. This is what you see right here is a freestyle step. So you can just provide any Docker image. It can be on the public registry. It could be on your own private registry, wherever. And then you can just run arbitrary commands in that image. So we use shell check for that. And then we see we have all of our parallel builds to build all of the steps, all the Docker files. And then they have interpolation in their pipeline. So you can use variables in your pipelines to do all kinds of stuff. Like here, we just tag each of the images with the build ID. That way, every single image has a unique tag. We have the test, and this is, again, one of my favorite things about Codefresh is the ability to reuse the Docker images that you built in the previous step downstream in the pipeline. So here on line 140, we're referencing the image from a previous build step and then running some commands. So these are the commands that we would actually execute in a custom step. So in the context of this pipeline, we're able to do a little smoke test on our steps before we actually release them to our internal step library. And of course, you have an approval step. So on topic branches, for example, we can say, hey, I approve this. push up like pre-release versions of the steps so then I can reference them in some pipelines that I'm testing. Here you see an example of the conditional steps or the conditional workflows. So you can create like any condition. So in this case, if this pipeline were built on master, we would just go for it, or if it had been manually approved on a topic branch. So here you see there's the reference to the any condition. This could also be all. And there's also like a shorthand for steps. And then push everything. And then again, referencing images and then using a built-in a script we've written actually to release this step to our Codefresh library. So now I want to give you a look into what these steps look like, because this to me is actually where the real moneymaker is. This is a thing that really makes it for me. So inside this steps directory, we have just a folder for all the different steps. So we kind of have two different layers of steps. One is, say, just a Codefresh step.yaml that runs some predefined commands using an arbitrary Docker image. The other one is where we actually build a Docker image and have a custom step. So this allows us to encapsulate like dependencies and context plus what to do. So for example, let me get a simple one for you. I think which one of these actually doesn't have one. Yes, so we have this one. This is a simple step called sanity check kubectl. And the idea here is that you can use this step early on in your pipeline just to check that it's been configured correctly, that it can access Kubernetes. So here we have a definition of the step, just the name, and then let's close this LinkedIn there. You have the arguments. So it's pretty cool actually is that you can define all the arguments for your steps with a JSON schema. So this one requires a kube context and a kube namespace because that's what it's going to try to connect to. And then from there, you can use what they call as a steps template. So it's a little bit esoteric in the way that it looks, but the idea here is that a custom step is basically a blueprint for adding steps to your pipeline. So you can templatize the steps so that when somebody adds it, it might create one or more steps, or you can actually, templatize it, the arguments, and templatize the commands. So if you read this is like if the kube context argument has been provided explicitly, then set the kube context environment variable. Otherwise, just infer whatever it is by the pipeline environment variable. Same thing for kube namespace, and then all of these commands. And I can actually show you what that looks like in one of our pipelines. Oh, it's the other one. Oh, anyway, I'll come back to that one. Sorry, I don't have the pipeline specifically handy right now, but I can show you one of the other ones. So let's go to the combination of Docker image plus step definition. So we can look at our run job. So the way this was set up for us is that we would have a Docker file and then one shell script to actually coordinate everything that we want to do for the particular step. So Docker file is usually pretty simple. Here we're just using like off-the-shelf Codefresh kubectl and adding whatever dependencies that we need, and then adding our script. Script is relatively simple also. We have some helpers for colored logging, and then find the job name, do a kubectl apply, and then like wait for the jobs to complete. If it succeeded, cool, write some output. Otherwise, fail and include some troubleshooting this turned out to be like really helpful for us. This one I know I can show you because we use it everywhere. You've actually already seen it. It's the pre-flight check. So now you can see here, okay, just done, successfully ran. And we have the same structure for all of these steps, like as I mentioned earlier. So for the deploy step, these all look the same. You know, we can see that there is some contextual information at the top. Here, all of the commands that it's doing. So one thing I recommend is if you're building custom steps like this is to be as verbose as possible in terms of what commands you execute for two reasons. One is it allows you, just makes troubleshooting and debugging much easier. But number two, it allows people who are unfamiliar with what's actually happening with that step or what's going on there to understand. Like you could copy and paste these commands into like your terminal and run them. It's not just totally opaque. Now, one thing, let's come back to one of these other steps here, and we can move on to the Q&A. Let's see. Yeah. So this is our step for the rolling deploy, which I just showed right here. And let's see here in this step. So you can, of course, also provide examples of how to use them. So the idea here is that as the maintainers of the steps, we would create some copy and paste examples that users could, copy and paste into their individual pipelines. See a more complicated definition of the arguments, just more arguments basically, and then the same type of information, like if it's explicit, use it, otherwise don't. And here you can see we have a reference to our Docker image that was built before, and then we just call our command with the rolling deploy. This is the shell script that's included in the image, and then just dump the deployment to manifest. Now, let me show you a little bit about how this, one of our pipelines actually, before we go on to the Q&A, the one that was small, we can talk about that one. All right, so this one is actually pretty cool in the sense that we have this pipeline folder. You can see that there's a Docker file. So this is the image that we would build that contains all of the dependencies required to execute all the different steps in our pipeline. We have a shell script to just kind of coordinate this whole thing, and then our deploy. So we have all of the stages. We have some sanity checks for like AWS access. Now, this is one thing that's also pretty cool when it comes to parallel steps. So parallel steps you can define as many different things as you want. This one actually only has one, but let's say that you defined a parallel step with 3 different steps. You can say for this step to succeed, maybe A needs to succeed B or C, or maybe all of the above. Now, scrolling down, this is where we start to see more of these conditions. So one thing that's what you can also do with Codefresh is that you can have steps like output environment variables. So one of these ones, say this one, plan development production platform, this step here actually outputs an environment variable to the pipeline. Where that comes in handy is that then you can use that as conditional logic into the pipeline. So this one we would only run if there was actually a Terraform diff. And that structure is just, let's see, repeated all the way down through the different stages. Here you can see here, ask for approval if there's any of these things. So if there was any diff on any of these 3 different Terraform operations, then prompt for approval. And down here, we see an example of like a shorthand steps syntax. So if you only care about the outcome of a particular step, like if it was skipped or succeeded or erred, then you can use this syntax. If you want to do more, like logic in the sense, checking on variables and values, then you can use this syntax. Now, I think that's actually all I want to show regarding our pipelines before we move into the Q&A. Yeah, here you can see if run this step if the approval happened and there is a diff. So you can mix and match all of these things. And with that, let's open it up for Q&A. And if you want to see back on that other slide, I'm more than happy to go for it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Adam. I do have a couple questions, and one that, may refer to going back to that one of the slides. One is, could you show us the approval step in the pipelines, or was it shown in one of your screenshots already?
Yeah, I can show you that one actually. Here, let's just come over to the big one here. So this is a build for the pipeline that for some reason was, let's pick one that succeeded. And now I'll just zoom out a tad. There we are. So here you can see there's some conditional logic. So these ones were all skipped. So here's the approval. This one had been denied. So one thing that's also nice with the approvals is you can define the outcome of or the end state of the pipeline if an approval was rejected, because sometimes, the approval step gates some optional action. You don't want to mark a build as failed and potentially mark like a commit as failed on GitHub. So even though like all of these are denied and that things were skipped, doesn't mean that the thing is actually failed on GitHub. Does that answer the question about approvals?
I think so. If the person, who asked, you can comment or ask another question if that didn't answer it for you. But just a reminder, if anyone has more questions, please feel free and answer them in the Q&A. We have a couple minutes here to answer some questions. And the next one is, did your kind of human processes change when you switched to Codefresh? So like, did you notice more time won due to parallel steps or anything like that?
Not really, actually. So the human processes didn't really have to change because they're like the end users were really well isolated from them, and the fact that earlier, let me switch over to a different screen here. I'll just switch back to this the presentation. So back in this slide, you can see here this example of this /deploy command. Codefresh was sort of an implementation detail for those doing the deploys. So the only thing that changed was that it's not shown in the screenshot, but after that, there would come a link to track your deploy. You would click that and that would go to Codefresh instead of our previous tool. But like in our case, it seemed like the execution times were more or less similar. But one thing I do want to call out regarding this is that Codefresh can be used for continuous integration and deployment stuff. Right now, we only use it for deploys. We are not doing builds and tests of application code. We're only accepting artifacts like Docker images and source code, and then using Codefresh to actually roll out code changes to our environments. But for the cases where I have done some rough build and test stuff, that is faster than other things that I have used. But we're not looking to migrate everything off Circle CI at the moment.
Right. And I just want, before people log out, I wanted to make sure that, if people want to work with you at Skillshare, do you guys have any job openings right now that maybe you're trying to promote, or have somebody come work on your team with you in Hawaii? You can work from Hawaii if you work for Skillshare, right?
That's true. You can actually work from anywhere. So we are hiring, I know for certain, a security engineer to come work on the SRE team. And I think that we're also hiring for other engineering roles. the company is fully distributed. I don't think, like everyone else, we were impacted by COVID-19, and we previously had an office, but now we're all remote. Previously, we were probably like half remote, but now everybody is remote. We have
But I'm
people.
sure way more people are using Skillshare now too, because they have extra time on their hands and need to
That's
actually using
true.
Skillshare.com. Yeah.
That's true. Our numbers actually do confirm that.
Excellent. And let's see, while we were chatting about that, Sergey asked in the chat, he said, sorry if he missed it and he was a little bit late, but do you use the same pipeline across multiple services? For example,
Mm.
the attaching of multiple microservice Git repos to the same pipeline.
No. So we could, but we chose not to because we wanted to have more flexibility at the individual service level. So I can actually show you like what this looks like for us. So all of our different pipelines all follow kind of the same similar structure. So let me just pick one for you. And let me switch over to this Codefresh window. There we are. And so here we go. Now, like I said, they all follow the similar structure. So like there's a prepare phase, we do some sanity checks, we report the GitHub deployment status, we clone, generate manifest. We run a pre-flight check with kubeval and our own custom pre-flight check. We do a rolling deploy, a smoke test, and then if the smoke test fails, we trigger a rollback. Otherwise, we succeed. So same structure, a little bit different for every single service. So like this pipeline.yaml is set in this like API gateway repository. Now, if we come to another project, yes, so this is our monolith. You can actually see some running right now. Kind of cool. But for this one, we're able to do some more stuff because every service is more or less the same, but there's of course always some specific tweaks required. So like in this pipeline, we had a conditional step for an emergency fix. Like when somebody is doing a rollout, we'll do a kubectl like set image to the SHA or to the like Docker image to get a faster resolution. And in this pipeline, we also have to do an additional step of uploading assets. Whereas like if we had put like one pipeline.yaml and some like shared trigger, we'd have to say like, hey, if repo equals X, do this. Whereas now we accept that some duplication is fine. And given that the other teams are responsible for those pipelines, that they can just make a PR to their code, edit the steps, change them, add, or do, whatever they need without having to rely on, say, like SRE or someone else to maintain this shared resource. I hope that answers your question.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, Sergey said thanks. So I'm gonna go ahead and launch a poll really quickly just to get everyone's feedback. Please let us know if you wanna see more webinars like this from awesome customers like Adam showing you kind of real life situations and how they have used Codefresh, or if you wanna meet with us or anything like that. So we appreciate you answering that poll. We have if you guys have any more last minute questions, we can answer them now. But if not, we thank everyone so much for joining us today. Like I said, this will be available as a recording, and I will send it out to you by tomorrow at the latest. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And thank you, Adam, for this awesome presentation. We really appreciate you and loved having you on Codefresh Live today.
My pleasure. And to everyone listening, if you have any questions about how we work at Skillshare or how we did any of this stuff, then find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever. You can find me online. Just hit me with a question. It's my pleasure to help you out and answer any questions you have. Like, I like doing this. I think it's really useful. It's made a big difference for us. Like, it's made my work easier. It's made me happier. So if I can help you have the same, then I'm more than happy to.
We love that. We love that you're made you happier. That's a great compliment. And I have added a link to Adam's podcast, Small Batches, as well as a link to his Twitter, so you can reach out to him there. All of that is in the chat. But thanks everyone so much, and we will see you next time on Codefresh Live. Bye bye.
Bye bye.